March 1946. Harlem, New York. The streets were alive that spring in a way they hadn't been since before the war. The soldiers were coming home. The factories were humming. Money was moving again. And for the first time in years, people in Harlem could actually breathe, could actually imagine a future where their children might own something, might be something more than what their parents had been. But Bumpy Johnson knew better. He sat in his office above Small's Paradise Jazz Club, looking out over Lenox Avenue, watching the crowds move beneath him like blood cells through veins. The city was healing, yes. But healing always attracts infection. And that's when politicians come. The man's name was Marcus Webb. Congressman-elect. Progressive. Reform-minded. The newspapers called him Harlem's Great Hope. He'd won the election on a platform of fighting corruption, cleaning up the numbers racket, bringing law and order to the neighborhood. The white establishment loved him. The black middle class loved him. The churches loved him. Bumpy Johnson had never even heard of him. Until Webb came to Harlem. Webb showed up on a Tuesday morning in March, fresh off his election victory. He was 42 years old, light-skinned, educated at Howard University, the kind of black man the system had decided could be trusted with some small piece of authority. He wore expensive suits. He had connections downtown. He moved through Harlem like a man on a mission, shaking hands, making speeches, promising to clean up the neighborhood. Webb's first move was to meet with Bumpy Johnson. Not because he wanted to, Webb didn't know anything about Bumpy yet. But because Webb's political advisors had told him that if he wanted to control Harlem's underground economy, he needed to understand it first. And the best way to understand the numbers racket was to talk to the man who ran it. So Webb sent a messenger. Tell Mr. Johnson that Congressman Webb would like to meet with him. At the church on 135th Street. Sunday, 2 p.m. Let's discuss the future of Harlem together. The messenger came back shaking. Bumpy had simply smiled and said, "Tell him I'll think about it." Bumpy did think about it. He thought about it for 3 days. He watched Webb move through Harlem, making his speeches, getting his pictures taken with community leaders. He watched Webb's security detail, small and competent. He watched the way Webb moved through crowds, confident, believing in his own righteousness. And Bumpy made a decision that nobody who heard about it later could quite understand. He agreed to meet. Sunday, 2 p.m., the church on 135th Street. Webb arrived with 3 aides and 2 security men. Bumpy arrived alone. Just him, dressed in his usual immaculate suit, walking in like he owned the place. Which, in a spiritual sense, he did. Webb stood when Bumpy approached. Extended his hand. Smiled. "Mr. Johnson. Thank you for coming. I wanted to talk to you, man to man, about Harlem's future." Bumpy shook his hand. His grip was firm, but not aggressive. Not a demonstration. Just a statement of fact. "Congressman Webb," Bumpy said, settling into a chair. "I heard you wanted to clean up Harlem." Webb nodded eagerly. "That's exactly right. This neighborhood has been exploited for too long. The numbers racket, the corruption, the organized crime. It destroys communities. It keeps people poor. I want to change that." "How?" Bumpy asked simply. Webb launched into his plan. Close down the numbers operations. Arrest the operators. Use federal pressure to clean out the corruption in the police department. Build legitimate businesses, community centers, youth programs. Transform Harlem from a place of crime into a place of opportunity. It was a good plan. Genuinely good. And it would have destroyed everything Bumpy Johnson had built. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When Webb finished, Bumpy nodded slowly. "I understand," Bumpy said. "You want to save Harlem." "Exactly," Webb said, relief flooding his face. I'm glad you understand. I was hoping we could work together on this. You have credibility in the community. If you use that credibility to help shut down the illegal operations, to encourage people to support legitimate business. No, Bumpy said quietly. Webb blinked. No? I won't help you, Bumpy said. But I also won't stop you. And with that, Bumpy stood up, shook Webb's hand again, and walked out of the church. Webb sat there, confused, unsure what had just happened. He'd expected either a fight or a negotiation. But this strange acceptance, this quiet refusal, was something he didn't know how to categorize. Over the next 6 months, Webb would try to understand what Bumpy meant. Webb threw himself into his reform campaign with religious zeal. He met with police commissioners. He worked with federal prosecutors. He built relationships with community leaders. He organized raids on numbers operations. He arrested collectors. He shut down policy banks. And Bumpy Johnson did nothing. That's the part that bothered Webb most, not resistance, but irrelevance. He'd expected Bumpy to fight him, to use his underworld connections to stop the reforms. Instead, Bumpy seemed to have simply withdrawn. The policy operations that Webb shut down weren't Bumpy's main operations. The collectors that got arrested were mid-level players, not core to the network. The banks that closed were peripheral. It was as if Bumpy had preemptively abandoned everything that could be easily found, leaving the real structure untouched but hidden. By summer, Webb felt like he was making progress. Newspapers wrote articles praising his reform efforts. Harlem's legitimate business community backed him. He was positioning himself for higher office, maybe the state legislature, maybe even Congress itself. But there was a problem Webb couldn't quite articulate. Despite his successes, he felt no resistance. It was like punching water. Every reform initiative went forward without opposition, but somehow nothing fundamental had changed. Crime was still happening. Money was still moving through Harlem's streets. The only difference was that now it was hidden better, operated more carefully, and nobody could quite see where it was going. By fall, Webb began to notice the other thing: Bumpy Johnson had simply disappeared from public view. He wasn't at Small's Paradise anymore. He wasn't conducting business from his office above the jazz club. He wasn't meeting with community leaders or politicians. He'd just vanished, leaving behind a network that still functioned perfectly without him, coordinated by people nobody had ever heard of, running operations that left no trace. Webb tried to find him. He sent investigators. He put out word that he wanted to meet. Nothing. Bumpy was simply gone. Months passed. Winter came. Webb's reform agenda stalled, not because of opposition, but because there was nothing left to reform. The visible crime had mostly been cleaned up. The networks were invisible now. The operations had become so sophisticated, so carefully hidden, that Webb's blunt force reform tools couldn't touch them. And Bumpy Johnson was still gone. By spring of 1947, Marcus Webb was becoming desperate in a way he couldn't quite explain to anyone. To the outside world, he was a success. His reform initiatives had cleaned up Harlem. Crime was down, at least the visible kind. Businesses were opening. Investment was flowing in. He was being mentioned as a possible candidate for mayor. But Webb knew something was wrong. He could feel it, like a pressure in his chest that wouldn't go away. Every time he walked through Harlem's streets, he felt watched. Not threatened, not even hostile, just observed. Catalogued. Measured. He began investigating Bumpy's organization from a different angle. Not trying to arrest them, but trying to understand them. How was the money still moving? Who was coordinating the operations? How had Bumpy managed to disappear so completely while keeping everything functioning? The more Webb investigated, the more he understood that he was looking at something fundamentally different from the crime operations he'd been fighting. This wasn't disorganized street crime. This was a sophisticated network. Bumpy had built something that could survive without him, something that was woven so deeply into Harlem's fabric that you couldn't remove it without destroying the entire community. And that's when Webb had the realization that would eventually destroy him. He'd already lost. Not militarily. Not even strategically. But fundamentally. He'd come to Harlem to clean it up, and what he'd actually done was organize the crime more efficiently. By pushing the visible operations underground, by forcing them to become more sophisticated, by eliminating all the mid-level operators who were messy and obvious, Webb had actually helped Bumpy consolidate his power and make it invisible. Bumpy hadn't fought him. He'd simply let Webb do the dirty work of elimination for him. And now Webb didn't know how to explain that to anyone without admitting that he'd been outmaneuvered by a man who'd never even appeared to be playing the game. The pressure on Webb intensified through 1947 and into 1948. Small things at first. His political allies began to distance themselves. Not publicly, not obviously. Just a subtle cooling. Invitations that stopped coming. Phone calls that didn't get returned. Meetings that got postponed indefinitely. Webb didn't know why. He investigated. His staff investigated. Nobody could find a specific reason. There was no scandal, no accusation, no threat. Just a gradual loss of influence, like air leaking from a balloon. At the same time, a strange thing began to happen to Webb's personal life. His wife became anxious, not without reason. She was being followed. Or at least, she believed she was being followed. Men in cars. People on street corners. Nothing threatening. Just present. Just watching. Webb's children started having problems at school. Not bullying exactly, but isolation. Other kids staying away from them. Teachers being slightly less engaged. Subtle, deniable pressure. Webb himself began to receive gifts. Anonymous gifts. A photograph of his wife on a street corner, her face clear, taken from across the street. A list of his children's daily schedule, where they went to school, what route they took, what time they arrived home. Nothing threatening about any of it. Just information. Just a demonstration that someone knew his family's movements. Webb tried to trace where the gifts were coming from. He couldn't. They appeared in his office, his home, his car. Always pristine. Always professionally done. Never any note, never any message. Just the gifts themselves, speaking clearly enough. And Webb understood, finally, what Bumpy Johnson had been doing all along. He'd been measuring him. By 1948, Marcus Webb was a broken man. To the outside world, nothing had changed. He was still the congressman-elect. He still had his position. He still gave speeches about reform and progress. But inside, he was disintegrating. He'd stopped going to Harlem for official business. He'd found excuses to avoid the neighborhood entirely. His staff noticed but didn't comment. His wife had become perpetually anxious, obsessive about security, convinced that something terrible was about to happen. Webb began to see patterns everywhere. A man reading a newspaper on the corner. A woman in a hat watching from across the street. A car that seemed to appear in his rearview mirror too often. Some of it was probably real. Most of it was probably paranoia. But the distinction no longer mattered. The effect was the same. He tried to talk to people about what was happening, but how could he explain it? That he was being watched? By whom? For what crime? He hadn't broken any laws. He wasn't doing anything illegal. He was just being observed. Made aware of his vulnerability. Shown that his family's safety was contingent on something, though he couldn't quite articulate what. Webb began to drink. His doctor prescribed pills. He stopped attending functions. He became withdrawn, paranoid, increasingly unreliable. And nobody could point to a specific cause. There were no threats. No violence. No crime. Just the slow, grinding pressure of being measured and found wanting, of understanding that a man he'd never even properly met had decided his time in Harlem was over, and was methodically, patiently, expertly executing that decision without ever pulling a trigger. In late 1948, Webb went to see a therapist. He didn't talk about Bumpy Johnson. He couldn't, it would sound insane. Instead, he talked about his anxiety, his paranoia, his sense that something was closing in on him. The therapist listened and eventually prescribed stronger medication. Nothing helped. On a cold morning in November 1948, Marcus Webb made a decision. He resigned from his position. Not publicly, not officially. He simply didn't attend the swearing-in ceremony for the new congressional session. His office issued a statement about health concerns. His doctor issued a note about stress-related illness. His advisors ran interference with the press. Within a week, the story had disappeared from the newspapers. Within a month, Webb had sold his house in Harlem and moved his family upstate. Within 3 months, he'd taken a position as a university administrator in Massachusetts, far from New York, far from Harlem, far from the man he'd never truly confronted. He never returned to Harlem. He never ran for higher office. He spent the rest of his life in academic administration, teaching occasionally, writing occasionally, but never again involving himself in politics. He died in 1975, a man who'd had every advantage, every opportunity, every credential for success, and had somehow been quietly destroyed by a man he'd only met once. And here's the remarkable thing, nobody ever knew exactly what had happened. Webb's political enemies claimed he'd been exposed as corrupt. His allies claimed he'd suffered a genuine mental breakdown. Journalists speculated about various reasons for his withdrawal. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. Marcus Webb had been slowly, methodically, and completely non-violently destroyed by a man who never threatened him, never raised his voice to him, never actually did anything to him at all. Bumpy Johnson had simply made Webb understand, with absolute clarity, that he was not safe in Harlem. Not his body, that would have been too crude. But his family. His reputation. His peace of mind. His sense of control. His belief in his own authority. All of those things, Bumpy had made contingent. All of those things, Bumpy had shown Webb could be taken away at any moment, by methods Webb could never quite identify or defend against. And then, having made his point, Bumpy had simply waited for Webb to leave. After Webb was gone, the pressure disappeared instantly. The surveillance stopped. The gifts stopped. The subtle pressure on Webb's family vanished. It was as if a switch had been turned off. Because it had been. Bumpy Johnson's message had been received and understood. Webb had left Harlem. The game was over. What made this different from anything else Bumpy had done, what made it so perfectly executed that it would become legend in Harlem, spoken about in quiet voices long after both men were dead, was that it had been entirely psychological. No violence. No threats. No crimes. Just a man proving to another man that in Harlem, authority doesn't come from a piece of paper or an election or the support of the outside world. It comes from something deeper. From roots in the community. From loyalty that can't be bought or broken. From an understanding of how power actually works in a neighborhood where legitimate authority has failed. Marcus Webb had come to Harlem to impose order from the outside, to clean up the neighborhood, to save it from itself. And Bumpy Johnson had shown him that Harlem didn't need saving by outsiders. Harlem had its own order. Its own rules. Its own justice. And when Webb had challenged that order, Bumpy hadn't fought him. He'd simply made Webb understand that he was irrelevant. That his authority meant nothing. That his family's safety was a courtesy, not a right. The lesson took months to sink in. But when it finally did, it was absolute. Here's what historians often get wrong about Bumpy Johnson. They focus on the violence. The 36 cuts at the Alhambra. The 8 bodies in 7 days. The razor blade that became legendary. But the truth is, violence was always Bumpy's least effective tool. His most effective tool was something far more sophisticated: understanding. Bumpy understood that in a neighborhood like Harlem, where police don't protect the community, where judges don't deliver justice, where politicians don't represent the people, someone has to establish order. And that order, to be effective, can't come from the outside. It has to come from within. When someone like Marcus Webb came to Harlem thinking he could impose order from the outside, thinking that reform from above could solve problems that only community-based solutions could address, Bumpy didn't try to stop him militarily. He simply let Webb exhaust himself, let Webb create the conditions for his own failure, and then let Webb understand that authority in Harlem belonged to the people who served Harlem, not the people who tried to save it. Marcus Webb tried to save Harlem. Bumpy Johnson served Harlem. In the end, Harlem chose its servant over its savior. Not through any dramatic confrontation, but through something far more powerful: the gradual, undeniable understanding that Webb didn't belong. And when Webb finally left, the neighborhood continued exactly as it had been, because the real authority, Bumpy's authority, had never actually been challenged. It had only been temporarily obscured. The silence before the storm, in this case, lasted months. And when it finally broke, it wasn't with thunder. It was with the sound of Marcus Webb's car driving away, toward a life in exile, unable to articulate to anyone what had been done to him or who had done it. That's the power that most people missed about Bumpy Johnson. Not his willingness to commit violence, but his willingness to wait. His ability to measure an opponent. His understanding of psychological pressure. His knowledge that the most devastating victories are often the ones that leave no visible marks. Respect is earned, not given. And sometimes, respect is earned simply by making someone understand that you don't need to destroy them. You only need to make them irrelevant. That was Bumpy Johnson's greatest gift. Not his ability to kill, but his ability to make people choose to leave. The streets of Harlem are different now. Bumpy Johnson is gone. Marcus Webb is forgotten. The numbers racket exists only in history books. The world has moved on. But the lesson remains. In any community where legitimate authority has failed, someone will establish illegitimate authority. And that person will win not because they're strongest, but because they understand something deeper: that authority in a community comes from service, from loyalty, from the slow accumulation of respect earned through consistent protection and consistent justice. Marcus Webb came to save Harlem from its crime. What he didn't understand is that Harlem didn't want to be saved by an outsider. It wanted to be served by one of its own. And Bumpy Johnson knew that lesson so perfectly, so completely, that he didn't even have to say it out loud. He just had to wait for Webb to figure it out himself. And when Webb finally did, all it took was silence to make him leave.